Thanks everyone for coming. This is kind of part of the art forum series that we're going to do more of a conversational style in some of the weeks. So keep an eye out on the Instagram. We'll be posting about people we'll be talking to, like curators, artists, also emerging artists and established artists. So just a big variation of people coming in. There'll be most Fridays at this point. So yeah, it's just to kind of engage the audience as well and have like a difference between just the lecture style of talking that we get a lot of in university. I'll just introduce our guest to start off with. And sorry, I've never done an interview before, so if I look flustered, it's probably because I am. So this is Scott. He's an Australian interdisciplinary artist. His work uses a mixture of sound, video, image, and objects in gallery and live contexts to create experiences that reflect upon cultural phenomena. He has been awarded a very long list of awards and scholarships, which I won't list all of them now, we'll be here for a while. And his work has been performed and exhibited both nationally and internationally. He studied here, which is very exciting. And alongside his studio practice, he's also a curator and has been involved in various boards and committees around Tasmania. So I'll also let you talk a little bit about your practice and introduce what you do. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thanks for having me, and it's cool to be back in this space, having studied, and there's some dear friends and old colleagues here, so it's a bit like spiritual home. But then also I know that Art Forum used to be really well attended and important here, and it's sort of a bit, it's been slumbering a bit post-COVID, so I think this is a really cool model. I'm a bit of a guinea pig for the in-conversation style, which I think it's interesting because the old style used to be, be shown 50 minutes of visual content. This is a bit different, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Abby, well done for putting energy into it, and just keep it rolling, get some help from your friends and colleagues, and thanks for that great intro. I haven't seen the questions really. I saw a few last night, but I deliberately haven't read them, so bear with us and see how it goes.
Yeah, it was a bit of a late message, that one, last minute. So I suppose I just wanted to start with just maybe a brief outline. I know it's hard, but just for people who aren't familiar with your work, what you do in general.
Okay, so I guess I make installation, if you wanted to categorise it, but generally, I started making visual images, paintings and drawings and collages, and I still kind of operate in that mode. I just apply that thinking to other media types, so video, sound, and sculptural installation. I guess if there's a through line over a long period, it's sort of dealing with not media like a specific type of media like televisual media, but maybe the media space like advertising, television, streaming, technology, and then I guess the things that influence that space like branding or trends or memes. So some kind of web of that stuff, that's the material, and then I guess what the projects are is sort of dictated by that particular idea. So it might be a signage project, it might be a series of imagery, it might be a live sound piece, or it might be a room filled with things.
Great. And in your kind of artist bio, you talk about your practice is about the experience of mediated environments. Can you talk a little bit about what that idea means to you and your practice?
Yeah. So I guess a mediated environment I'm using to mean maybe the social sphere of those media that I listed. Our general environment, wherever we are and how we're influenced by media. So whether that's like, say recently, like all locked at home doom scrolling, or a decade ago, how we were consuming media then, so downloading torrents of illegal content and sharing them in that way, or maybe a decade before that, how we were sharing mediated material, which was, recording an audio cassette and handing it to someone else, and maybe a decade before that, we had just some legitimate outputs, like the purchased audiovisual material, so that mediated environment changes over time. So I guess in the past I've done works that look at say, when file downloading was really the prevalent mode of sharing culture, downloading a series of files and halting that process, so breaking it and then seeing what that looks like. Whereas now that process would be something else. It would be some kind of glitch or a stream, or so it's trying to treat a mediated environment as temporally important. Like we were discussing prior to this, trying to anticipate an audience. It's like, do people come to lectures anymore? Should this just be a stream? Should this just be an audio recording? What should media be now?
And so your practice does use quite a diverse range of mediums and processes. What is it about art as a form, like a communicative tool, that interested you in starting to use it to talk about these ideas?
I guess it's that it can be enigmatic. So, you know, communication is tricky. It's often, there's a gap between what you transmit and what people receive, whether that's spoken or written communication. So I guess what's interesting about art as a communicative tool is that it doesn't have to be so literal or direct. It can be enigmatic, it can be wrong, it can be misinterpreted, or it can really hit the marks. People don't have to get it, but someone might, I guess. It's that sort of, yeah, so it's not a direct form of communication, I guess, is what appeals to me, is that it can do a bunch of stuff. Not necessarily well, but it can do a bunch of stuff.
And how has your work evolved over time? Like, how has it changed? Have you always been interested in the same ideas, or has it been very much influenced by, I mean, it definitely would be, by how vastly the mediated environment has changed? But yeah, have you always been interested in that mediated environment?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think there's like, if there's there's that some cheesy saying, you know, that all artists are just making the same work over and over again. So I think that there's a truth to that. Like there's some core idea that might be about trying to pass or understand or receive information. So like a kind of notion of sensory overload, or something to do with the sheer amount of information, like the kind of data mountain. That seems to be like a consistent idea. But then, no, I don't think it has changed dramatically. Like you evolve processes over time, you know. It might become more elegant or more well executed, or you might have better stuff in your studio. But yeah, for me, I think you're kind of in a space or in a pool of ideas, and they're migrating around. So for me, no, I don't think it's evolved dramatically. You learn things along the way. Like recently I did a project last year for MonaFoma as an artist, and it was the first project I'd ever done that had a producer. In the past, I was critical of artwork that had that structure around it, where the artist didn't do all the work. They just had some ideas and other people did the work. But having worked in that model, I can see the advantage of it, because like, it really shifts how you're thinking. The work was, so me and another artist, we sort of fell in love with the idea of old electric organs. So we collected as many electric organs as we could from around the state, and we installed them all in the town hall ballroom upstairs in the city, and we created a system where visitors could like get given a little weight, like a bolt or a sandbag, and they could come in and put it on the keys or the bass pedals. So it made a big long drone made by everyone. But as artists, to make that show, there's no way we could do it. Like, you need 2 removalists, a van, you need someone driving around picking them up, you need somewhere to store them, you need someone to move them in a goods lift 1 unit at a time and install them in the space. So working in that way with better resources, for want of a better term, meant that you can do projects you couldn't do. So that's like a development. It's a changed way of working, but it's really just having more tools, really. Yeah.
And as someone who does do work that involves the public, how did you find that period of COVID, and did that make you kind of go out of your comfort zone in making work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've always made work that's kind of digitally distributable, so that didn't change too much. But that work for MonaFoma, I worked on it for a year. and my household tested COVID positive a day before the show opened, so I effectively couldn't attend the show. I got 8 hours in that space that we'd spent a year building. So that kind of informed how we approached it. I sat at home on a Zoom call, and we put an iPad on a tripod in the space. So I was just a little talking head there. Matt Ward, my colleague, was able to step in as one of the other operators. So someone I trusted could be an artist in that space, making sound, guiding the public. So we made it work. But I think during actual COVID lockdown, I did some webinars and some like limited edition t-shirts and keychains, you know, like stuff that you could distribute without leaving home.
Yeah. And with those works that can be distributed, how do you feel like when you kind of seize control over that work once it has been given over to the public, and what they do with that work?
I think that's cool and fascinating bit to see. I mean, editions are interesting as an artist, and you know, some artists work in this commercial space where they make one object and it's revered and rarefied and expensive, or they make multiples of that. I like the idea of edition prints or easily obtainable things. So I did a series for Contemporary Art Tasmania years ago for their shop, which was these really limited edition hoodies, and they were based on, like, if you go onto a cheap Chinese website to buy t-shirts, they'll have your blank t-shirt and it'll say, you know, your print here or your text here. So we just took that and made high-end versions of them. So like $100 hoodie that said your text here, that was printed locally, that there was only 5 of them. And so doing that edition was really fascinating. Like, I see someone on the bus wearing that hoodie. So it's kind of like, it's playing with the idea of fashion, and it's a joke on high-end, low-end, mass-produced. But seeing them out there in the world is interesting. Someone's invested in the idea that that one's different than the one that they could buy for dramatically less that's not an artwork off a website. Yeah. So I think that's interesting when you don't have control over the work. A work that I did again for a Mona Festival for Dark Mofo for this art school, actually, on the exterior of this building, had a pretty unforeseen public effect. So I think there's some power in that. You can also get it wrong, but it's like, that's the risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually do have some notes about that one. Shitstorm.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a controversial topic. So when you were interviewed about it, you were saying that it was a work with high impact. What is the type of experience that you try and create for the viewer, and what response are you hoping to evoke with your work?
I think, work like that, using the term high impact is interesting, right? Because when you're an artist, you're working in these spaces, you get invited to do a project, and the project has a 3-month time frame, and you're being poorly paid, and it has some ideal outcomes, like the people who are asking you to do this stuff, they want something. They want either a beautiful show or they want deliverables, like whatever their funding application says this thing's going to do, that terminology bubbles through. So it's like, high impact is, high impact and low expense is kind of this thing that we as artists get put into a lot, which is like, here, make something amazing on the smell of an oily rag, do it over and over again. And when I come to your opening, I'll ask you what you're working on next. So you're always in this kind of future space or never resolved. So that work was interesting. I worked on that so John Ballard curated the project that came through. And my original idea for that was, I'm going to not know the artist's name, and this is poor form, but the sculpture that's out there in the courtyard, the wooden, colourful sculpture. So my original idea for that show was to cover that whole wooden sculpture in black cable ties, so thousands of black cable ties, so just a nest of them. And we couldn't contact the artist. And so I didn't want to do it without permission and cause offence to that artist or their estate. I think ultimately it got too late in the piece and we kind of got a thumbs up. But it was too late to do that work, and it was in the depths of winter to enact. And so I was in this space where it's like, well, I have these other ideas, and I'd already pitched an idea into the collaborative exhibition development around signage on this building. And then mimetically, the stuff I was looking at that was of interest, it was the time when, so it's a lesser known cultural reference, but the Westboro Baptist Church, which is this kind of hateful anti-LGBTQI church in the US, was protesting publicly using these kind of rainbow signage aesthetic. And so it kind of merged those things. It was this idea of not wanting to cause offence with this work, but then being in this space where I'm thinking about causing offence, or the ability to do so, and then thinking about this kind of deeply resentful, misunderstood, prejudiced meme that I'm seeing from the US, and kind of mashing that into, well, how does that manifest in this project? And what can be done in this space, like in, say, the gallery, which is in the basement, which is poorly attended and underfunded, like to make the work, to amplify it and stick it all around the external of this building, which was something I could do, we did have access to. So it was about trying to see what the potential was to amplify something. And I guess the other context was that was Dark Park at the time, so all of that industrial area over there. So it spoke back to this other military industrial complex that I also work for, which is Mona, which is this kind of simultaneously positive and negative transformational entity that's here.
Yeah, and it's also that kind of, although the work was taken down, so for those of you who aren't familiar with it as well, it was just, is it Corfu?
Yeah.
Boards were pasted all around the top windows of this art school, your artist shit on it. And it was up for 3 days during Dark MoFA, and then it got taken down, and then moved to the Plimsoll. But yeah, it's just also, I suppose, like that removal of the work, and then even though it's no longer visible to the public, that act of taking it down and it becoming a controversial topic still means that people are talking about it, even though it's gone.
Yeah, it became more visible down there, actually. It became like a highly Instagrammable down there in the gallery. So, and it caused some shit for people internally who worked on it in this building, like Curator as well. So I think that there's some hit and miss in that work, but it did something. And it was difficult to make a work afterwards, because it's like, well, like you're definitely not going to do a high impact public offence work after that. It's like, that bit's done. How do you, what next is the question.
And how would you describe your conceptual process? How do you find the subject matters that you're going to be working on next? I suppose it's always interesting for students and people who are making art, like to learn about other people's processes.
I think it's, it's a lot of reading and looking. I don't journal as much as I used to. I don't feel like I've got time for journaling in anything that's like a traditional journal sense. I'm mentally journaling. Bookmarks are probably journaling. I guess ideas build up. So I was trying to think through that with the show at CAT that we'll talk about. A lot of that work is work that I would look at in a journaling sense, so like peers or artists who I go, oh, that's interesting. Or I gather a series of things they're like a visual map of what you're into or thinking about or influences you now. But that show's kind of sat and been thought about for a bit longer, so there's maybe more going on than just here's a list of things I like. But I guess in terms of conceptual development for projects, sometimes it's driven, like Shitstorm was, by this frame. It's like, you've got this building, it's in this context of a festival, you've got a time frame, you've got a budget, and you've got some things that are bubbling up. So it might be arts funding buzzwords like high impact, or it might be the weird rainbow aesthetic of a anti-LGBTQI church, like the tension in that kind of idea. So at some stage you'll be thinking about it for long enough to be like, oh, maybe that's a thing, maybe that's a thing. I guess if there's like long running concepts, they are things like appropriation. So when I studied here, I was all about appropriation, which is, copying people's stuff basically, or in a transformative way where possible. So maybe that's the kind of conceptual underpinning. I'm seeing things, taking note of them, and I'm maybe copy pasting them later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and bringing them together to create, you were saying, tensions, which is also, I was looking at the solo show that you did, called Romantic Conceptualism, and you were saying that you liked these terms because they were semi-paradoxical and clunky. Is paradoxes and tensions something that you seek to create in your work?
Yeah, definitely, and in conjunction with kind of enigmas, I guess. So romantic conceptualism was that I made at the time, similarly on a system. So it was the rise of the gig economy, and there was a website called Fiverr where effectively you could pay someone $5 to perform a task for you. So that task might be proofread my essay, my one-page essay. It might be make a video greeting card for my boyfriend. It might be a singing telegram on video. So it was this broad range of things that you could pay someone $5 to do, and they would deliver you something. So in the sort of novelty section of Fiverr were all of these weird performative things that you could have someone do. So you could have someone be a clown and recite your message. You could have a heavily tattooed woman smoke a joint and recite your message. You could have someone animate a 3D version of a car crash out of which your message would bloom. So that kind of became of interest, yeah. And you could have someone jump from a parachute and hold your message on a piece of cardboard. Like all these quite romantic things, beautiful, aesthetic, weird little things. And I guess I was looking then at the time, art theory-wise, the turn towards romantic conceptualism was like the resurgence in interest in artists like Bastiaan Aarde, the Netherlands conceptual artist. So, you know, conceptualism's always been this, conceptual art or minimal art's always been this hyper-controlled masculine space about the absence of things or the control of things, the right-angledness of things. Whereas Bastiaan Aarde and artists like that were working with this rich conceptual space that's minimal. It's like a black and white film of me crying, you know, or his last most famous failed work was this called In Search of the Miraculous, where poorly planned with very little training captained a ship and, you know, just never came back. Like, it's kind of these really dumb ideas as well, but there was a resurgence in the interest around his work at the time, because it's like, it's like institutions need to make something a thing, like minimalism or like conceptualism, and then they need to find like this oppositional turn within it that's like, oh, here's these people who are breaking the rules. And so the term romantic conceptualism already exists, and it's used to describe that kind of work. Yoko Ono's early work also is described as romantic conceptualism. Yeah, so text descriptions of her artworks like record the sound of snow falling, listen to the tape for as long as you like.
Like ogre stuff, like that.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that sort of bit where it's like before Fluxus got just done by boring dudes, the bit before then where there's some really beautiful, rich ideas in there. So for me, it was like, well, it's horrifying that there's this slave capitalist system where you can just order a service online and people's expertise and life experience get reduced into $5 chunks. Yeah, like it's horrible, but it's also quite amazing. Like, so that's what that work was doing. So I commissioned something like 20 digital images and 12 digital videos that just, all I sent them was the prompt romantic conceptualism. So if you're the dude holding the sign from parachuting, it's on your sign. If you're the heavily tattooed girl smoking a joint, that's your text prompt. And that's the work, and they're just installed in the space. You look at the photographs and you watch the videos loop. I apologise to every gallery invigilator who's ever had to sit through that show, because it is a month or more of just those two words being recited in various fashions over and over again. But that work really did something as well. So it was shown here as a solo commission at CAT, and it was shown at Wagga Wagga Regional Gallery. And then there was a single channel version of it, just the videos, all one after the other, shown in the Bangkok Underground Film Festival, which was just a test really to see if this would work as a film. It works in the weird section of a film festival, but there's not enough narrative to hold it together.
And I suppose we'll now move more onto the show that Scott curated. It's on at Contemporary Art Tas at the moment. It's on to the 1st of April, called Last Messages. So yeah, it was just maybe a question about your curatorial process. So you say that your exhibition concepts arise out of your engagement with artworks that are aesthetically and conceptually influencing your output, as you mentioned before. Is this the process that you usually use to select your curatorial concepts, and are you at the moment working on a piece as well that is working within that idea?
Not really. So I guess the way that show arose, so CAT I've had a long involvement with in various forms of fashion. I did the emerging curatorship at Contemporary Art Tasmania like 15 years ago, and I was looking at screen-based media and kind of performative or diaristic screen-based media. And a few years ago I was sat briefly on the programming committee of CAT. So, in the same way that this group might lean into helping program this kind of activity, over time some of you will get involved in boards and committees and artist-run spaces, and CAT, I was lucky enough to sit on the programming committee, which is like a quarterly meeting that would help determine the program. And as part of that, there was a curatorium to come up with some ideas for exhibition content, and Last Messages didn't really make sense in CAT's charter, because its charter is to support Tasmanian artistic practice. I was thinking more expansively, like contextualising a few Tasmanian artists in amongst a bunch of other work. It didn't make sense for them at that time, but it did make sense as part of something like MonaFoma, where it has a broader scope. It can fit both boxes. So I started thinking about the idea maybe 3 years ago with only about half the artists who are in this version, and it was again a meme or a mimetic thing. It was pre-Trump, pre the mainstream rise of conspiracy theory. So it was back when it was weird to think about conspiracy theories. And there's a great briefly lived YouTube channel called Last Messages, and it was effectively someone like just pasting together videos of, I guess you'd call it like weather and other type of phenomena that they thought signaled the end of days. Yeah, so it'd be things like a bit of chemtrail footage, some birds behaving strangely, some dead fish somewhere, like one after the other, and they were just called Last Messages. So it's like no narration, no text, just evidence of something. That idea just stuck as this thing of, okay, this weird gathering, bowerbirding, out in the media space, stitching this stuff together, not taking responsibility for what it suggests or means, but just doing it anyway as a practice. So Last Messages, the idea came from that. So it's not like a literal, these are the last messages. So I guess I was thinking through that. And then we had this pandemic, that impacted the world in various ways. We are relatively unscathed here, but we all know or did lose some people. And then it was catastrophic in some ways, as in people are still dying from that. So we did have a real and literal semi-apocalyptic event. And so then after that, it was like, oh, maybe this idea has some weight. So if I do that again 2 years later, which is, early 2022, what's that idea? So I pitched it back to CAT and to MonaFoma, and it fitted in that role. So then I had about a year to go, okay, well, let's get those artists together. And there were some key artists who I'd wanted to work with or show their work who I knew would fit. And then the rest became about, well, what is that idea now? Because it's not just a literal, here's some works that maybe refer to the end of days. Like there has to be something more going on than that. And I think, my tendency as an artist is to be quite literal, and the exciting bit about curating stuff is you don't have to be so literal. Like you can let the audience do heaps of work, and you can put a work in there that maybe only really just connects a little bit to the theme. because no one's holding you to account for that. Like no one's checklisting, like how much does this one relate to either the title or the concept. So I think there's some freedom in there.
And you talk about this idea of blackened utopias, which is part of this show. And so utopia, it means nowhere, which it's an interesting concept. And I suppose like when it was first spoken about in Thomas More's book, it was an act of imagination. And for me, your show, like there was definitely like this kind of like liminal space about it, and also like a sense of like atemporality. Like there were references from the past, and then there was more analog, digital things that are going on, but also very like futuristic visualizations. And yeah, so I suppose like, do you think that the events of the last few years have like tainted our ability to even imagine a utopian future?
Yeah, I don't know, that's a pretty heavy question. That's a cool question though. Yeah, maybe, but look, maybe not any more than any other previous events had. You know, as in, I guess, yeah, it's an interesting way to crack that open. The show does try and do this thing where it's like, it's got some references, it's got some long past references, whether that's like the visual style and format of one of the video works, or some of the materiality like the Zero Muko works being acid water sheets. And then there's another work by Yoshi Sodioka that it kind of uses this psychedelic tunnel format or trope, but when you look at it, it's kind of got about 4 decades of visual tropes in it, and so you travel through time in the work. So it is trying to be of multiple times or through multiple times. I think we've always envisioned some type of end of days, and I guess maybe where I started using that term in describing the show was in the work of Winston Smith, who is, he's kind of, I guess, one of the most significant living collage artists. His work is known originally from, he did all the collages for the seminal punk band Dead Kennedys, but since then he's been just practicing for kind of 40 years. He's quite elderly now. The work is like analog collage that's really critical of capitalism, but it's also incredibly beautiful. And so it's kind of got this thing where you're like looking at it, it's hilarious, but the scenes are Boschian, you know, like they're actually quite dark, and but because it's mediated through the language of advertising, it's heaps easier to read or something. And so Winston's interesting, like he has been making this collage work. He left San Francisco when COVID hit, and he and his wife, who is also quite elderly, live in a yurt in the woods about 2 hours from San Francisco City. He has limited power and limited internet access. And so I've just been corresponding with him over a few years since I ran a small kind of experimental commercial gallery with some friends. And so I've never been able to get much original work out of him. It's all in an archive, and subsequently in the last year or two, he's managed to get a young gallery to represent him. And so now they're actually going back through this archive that could have almost been lost of about 40 years of his collage work and making accessible, distributable work from it. But his correspondence in a way is, I was trying to work out how to include it in the show, but it's kind of a bit too personal, and he wouldn't see it as work, he would just see it as emails. But it's actually of real value, and it links this sort of escape the city, prepper, hippie punk thing that's happening in the show that Joey Gracia's work also does in the show, which is this, it's a domestic refrigerator covered in magnetic letters, but it spells out as much of the Unabomber manifesto as can fit on a domestic refrigerator in magnetic letters. That text is obviously highly problematic, yeah, but it's also this kind of early, could be perceived as an early green text, and it's actually been critically kind of re-reviewed in the last decade or so, including like academic publishing of the text, because of some of the kind of prophetic claims that were made in the text that have now come to fruition about industrialisation primarily.
And
It doesn't answer your question at all.
it was a big question. We
Yeah,
were
yeah,
here for
yeah.
a
But
very
no,
long
I think
time.
I think we've always envisaged apocalypses, and I guess that's why I was trying to reference something that was not like, hey, we just kind of had a little apocalypse. It was more like we've always envisaged these things, and there's something about looking into the mouth of that artists do, like whether that's an existential abyss or some kind of real abyss. You know, artists are interested in the environment, the end of the world, how we live, what could be done better. We're often not in a position to enact much change in that space because we're making things to show each other. Like, it's not the best way to enact action, but on another level, it creates this web of ideas. And so, you know, it's hilarious to me that Winston, for example, is sat there in a yurt away from civilization, cutting up magazines to make these collages that are hypercritical of civilization.
Yeah, it's like he's removed himself from actually being an active and actively engaging in the issues that he's trying to make art about.
Yeah, or maybe he's doing like what he most potently can with his skill set to communicate that idea.
Yeah,
because the collages do have power. Like, so I know a whole bunch of people who are like wouldn't really care about the aesthetic of collage, but are like, oh, I remember that. Like, I remember that aesthetic, or I've seen that. It's transmitted as a record cover 40 years ago, you know, but it's a through line. It transmitted a message then that was critical, and it still does. So it's actually, like, for one man to spend their life doing that, like, there's some real weight there.
Yeah, and how much do you think art has the ability to show people that there are possible futures, that maybe like positive futures that we can move towards? Because it's like creative visualizations of the future is how we almost end up reaching those points, because it's created visually and it's imagined. And then do you think that actually also drives technological change to reach that point in the future? Or
I'm not sure. I mean, my show doesn't propose possible futures, really. It kind of assesses them, you know. In a way, there's some bleakness in that show. Like John Zabelli's video works, they're from about 10 years apart. One of them's called Still Life, and it's just like fruit, objects and fruit laid out on the table, shot with a camera. It's playing with the idea or the trope of a still life, but then it's got this kind of hyper empty soundscape that loops over and over again. It has no depth, but it's really melancholy. So, you know, it's not proposing anything. It's not fixing anything at all. But it's like, it's illustrating a state or a space. And similarly, his other work, which is a nice, maybe romantic conceptualism work, which is called 2000 Images, which is just the amount of images that he accrued in one folder between ceasing, you know, going, I'm going to stop collecting images about this and I'm going to start collecting images about something else. So an arbitrary point. And then when he accumulated 2000, for whatever reason, they just run after one after the other really fast. So when you first watch the work, it kind of looks like it's about nothing, or that nothing is going on, but there's 2000 different visual things going on. And if you kind of tune into its pace, you start to pull those fragments out. Again, it's not about anything except maybe the accumulation of data in one person's mind over a brief period. So in essence, you know, like, it's not proposing any better space to be in. Yoshi Sodioka's work maybe, but it's an abstract space. Like, it's just taking you through a temporal thing that's maybe a bit like a trip, that's maybe a bit like a dream. It might be that, you know, the white light state that you see at death or ascension, but he's not really prescriptive about it. So I don't know that art can do that. I think artists can influence maybe other structures like corporate, political and economic structures, and that's probably a better way to enact change than trying to communicate it through aesthetic outputs.
Yeah, and I suppose like what that show I think does quite well is it shows like a kind of the shared sentiment, I think, of that kind of oversaturation of content and kind of it seems like a bit stuck in time, and that it's not quite utopian or dystopian, but it is a bit like melancholy, and I think it's I just felt that it was it still affected me in that sense because I'm like, oh, other people feel similarly. It's a shared kind of understanding.
Yeah, there's a work in the show that's kind of a quiet winner, like, so when you're in the space, there's the still life video. It has this sort of haunting Phil Collins loop over and over again, so that permeates the room. Yoshi's beautiful big psychedelic video kind of dominates the space, but there's this other video work by Adelaide artist Ray Harris, and she's known for making performative single channel video. She's always in front of the camera in some form or fashion, but in this work called Ritual for a Failed Self, she's excavating, she grew up in a kind of what she calls a self-help cult. So it's kind of like presented to her as innocuous health and well-being, meditation, hippie kind of space. But in hindsight, she's realised that, there was the distant overarching male guru figure. There was some kind of social and mental control in the space. Like, as an adult, she's assessed it as a toxic kind of space. She's addressing it through the work, but in this really non-direct way. She's playing with the idea of ritual, of lighting candles, of imbibing substances, of being veiled, of ritual incursion through that veil. So it's like, it's a super indirect way to deal with it, but also it's a really it's really effective in that space. Like, it's not communicated in the text, so the show deliberately doesn't explain much about the works. Kind of explains my stance briefly in 1 or 2 paragraphs, but that's it. And we sort of deliberately didn't go down the route of having these expansive texts about each work. I don't know if in hindsight that's a good idea, because something like that with Ray Harris's work, it does help to understand that. And the stories about Winston's work are also, I think, really interesting. But I guess as a curator, you've got that choice of like, how much is this about the work, or how much is this about informing text that underpin the work or value add to the show or something? Yeah.
Just so we have some time for questions afterwards, I'll just ask like a final question to wrap things up, but everyone go and see the show if you haven't. It's really good. So I suppose like maybe just to finish off, is there anything that like any advice that you've been given throughout your career so far that you've really taken on, has been really important, and that you'd like to share with us? End on a lighter note.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Support your friends and their artistic journey, because they'll support yours, and it's kind of like. So I think that's it. Like, and then put work into what you think's important. So, whether that's organising a slightly different model of art forum, rally some support and help around that. Don't take on more than you can reasonably do, or get, sometimes the structures around art making become, you spend all your time doing that. So speaking from someone who's run spaces and galleries and sat on boards and committees, if what you want to do is make art, you do have to actually leave some time for that. Otherwise you just become an arts professional, and arts professionals are fantastic. They help artists do things, and they also make and affect amazing change. They run art schools, they teach, but that's a slightly different thing. So I think that's been a challenge for me, is like how to be an artist and not be an arts professional. But yeah, I think it's like supporting each other's ideas and visions. So sometimes that's simple, sometimes that's just showing up or spamming your friends and colleagues' content, but other times it's like really deeply investing in their ideas, or trying to understand it or hold them to account, make them explain it, knowing that they'll do the same thing for you at some point. And then I guess too is like just come back to it. Like some things or ideas don't work. I don't know. You can abandon an idea too early. I think, yeah. So I don't know if that's my advice.
It's good advice, thank
Cool,
you.
thank you.
I'll open up to some questions if anyone does have anything to ask.
Little observation. They were great questions.
Thank you.
I was trying to think of things I could ask him to cover. Must.
They were good questions, hey?
They really were, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, better answers, so that's helps.
Yeah, but you said at the beginning you haven't done any interviewing before, but you've got the vibe. It's good. Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I want to talk about is the visual aesthetic. I've obviously done the work for a long time, and there's a shift which may be temporal, but I would describe you as what tongue in cheek as a messy artist traditionally.
Yes.
This stuff without the chords and like that. You look at last messages.
Yeah.
It's pretty.
Yeah.
It is. I know that's the utopia, isn't it? The subject matter might be all sorts of things, but to walk in, it's kind of glorious and colourful.
Thank you. Yeah, that's
the work at MonaFoma last year too. It's very neat and organised. That has something to do with the town hall, I suppose. It's kind of like the way it was. It wasn't like I could imagine 10, 15 years ago those organs would have been in piles, and now it's all organised. So I don't know if
it would have
that's
been
a
in one pile in the middle, totally inaccessible.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's a shift or it's even conscious or.
Yeah, and I think that is a good observation actually. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, look, part of the reason Last Messages is pretty is because like Cat is a difficult gallery in some ways to make pretty because it's a working gallery. You helped with the lighting. That's another reason it's pretty. But the work in a way, yeah, the choice is that it is colourful. Like when we got it all in the space, it was like actually like it's vibrant, even though the content's dense. I think too. So I work now. My role is kind of in the information and technology space for Mona Museum, but for a long time I worked in the time-based media space there, installing work. So I think that institution has spoiled me a bit in terms of the detail. Like we obsess a bit there over detail. So when installing works, like I redid a lot of the cabling in that show to make it. Yeah, and because it makes the work more present if you're not aware of the tech, you know. Yeah, and I guess that town hall show, yeah, we made a conscious decision. So with the town hall, we saw two spaces that we could put the 50 vintage organs in, and one of them was a warehouse back here, and that would have it wouldn't have worked, you know. It would have just felt like two stoners, 50 organs, old warehouse. But that ballroom,
Sounds good.
That ballroom's amazing, right? It's like, it's parquetry floors and it's got these slightly terrible paintings of famous European composers all over the walls. It's got this floral skirting, everything's hyper decorated. And it's a formal space where you go to become an Australian citizen in Tasmania, and it's also where they have flower shows. So when we went to tour the space, there was a flower show going on, and we had scones and tea. You know what I mean? So there's something going on in there, like where it's a hyper-controlled space. But yeah, I mean, some of the work I would have done earlier, you're right, would have had lent into that junk aesthetic. And I think maybe my work still does a bit. The town hall work was a collaboration. Yeah, but no, I hadn't thought about it like that. Thank you.
I see the utopia in your kind of practice as being that idea of memory. I just kind of think of like the Penny Contemporary show with the signs that you redrew from memory and things like that. And then you just kind of got these links through, and even this show, you know, just that kind of idea of someone like Joey Grazia being in a show with Winston, just knowing Joey and just how excited that would have made him and the influence that's had on him. And there's this it is that real romance that you take, and that romance that it seems to carry through, and just thinking about that, or your artwork shit thing, you know, and just thinking about my response then, being in the building, my response now, and thinking about it, it's just like, what is have you talked to any of the people who really got up in arms since that?
Yeah, I think so.
What are the conversations, like, do they shift? Do they really kind of, because it was really just emotion when it first happened.
Yeah, look, some of it's just about things like building politics, you know,
Yeah.
like real estate politics in a way. Like this school, all of art schools are interesting in that way. This one's interesting in that you do have kind of a medium hierarchy across the building. People occupy space differently. So, you know, that work had to impose on people's space. It had to impose on people's light. And light's important in various realms of an art school. But also it's about, like, I don't know, like whether or not it's a success or not, like consultation or the lack thereof. And so, you know, within a structure like that, you've got all these things. You've got consent forms, you've got discursive consultation, you've got, like, what's the impact of this activity? To do all that smoothly would kind of smooth out the rough edges of the work a bit.
Get everybody to talk to everybody and make sure everybody's comfortable.
And sometimes that's not, it's either not possible or it's just not desirous, because then there's no potential.
But it wouldn't have worked, would it? Like it would have.
Well, no, because you know, I mean, you only have to have one detractor effectively to kill any good idea or bad idea.
But it's that. But then the moving to the things, or as you say, it's a social media thing, so it becomes this idea of the notion of collective memory and this real shit.
Yeah.
This distant kind of almost inaccessible thing that's perched up in some windows, but is kind of hyper accessed by the people who then feel like they're being talked about. Their art is shit.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it goes into this kind of like stasis in the gallery, which is just completely bizarre. But then, as you say, it becomes extremely social media friendly.
Yeah, well, because people can access it. And I think we didn't anticipate that. We thought, well, that's a failure to move it there. But then basically people just wanted selfies with it, which is actually, that's kind of how we relate to aesthetic things now. You know,
but that felt like at the time really almost like the positive of the situation, at least from an external point of view as a student. Like,
look, for me, I think the whole work, like, despite even annoying some people, the whole thing felt positive, which is weird to say because you don't want to annoy people. But
well, and I mean, some of those posts, those social media posts were quite brutal.
But also social media is not known for its subtlety or its.
But you've got people who are like
politeness
and stuff, just like
It
was.
That's okay. Though.
Of course, it's okay. Like, but that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, but I just think of being a student and being like a very like
active,
overly emotional, like just like highly strung idiot, and it's like I got offended at that. Why did I get? I don't even know why, but it's like there's a certain level of the artwork there, and it is there's something to that, as you're saying. Right?
Well, we all love different things, and so then we're all going to love and hate other things. Like there's artworks we're deeply passionate about that we've possibly never even seen. We just have we've invested in some reproduction of it, or we saw it when we were a child, or it meant something to someone else, or that's the passion that we're all here working with. Like that's what you've got. That's what's driving you when it doesn't work, or when you're not being well recognised or remunerated. Like that's the bit that's the fire. I think that's I hadn't thought about that change, Matt, but what did occur to me just then, I was thinking I did lucky enough to do 2 residencies in 2 different artist-run spaces in Bangkok, and the first one was in this really dingy concrete space, lots of mess. Like it would have been really easy to lean into what was then my aesthetic. But I set up this thing where I made everything ultra neat in that space. So it was this sort of Victorian hang of works on one wall and then all of the equipment. It was the first bit where I started becoming really conscious of, every cable's a black line and sort of thinking about them as things in the space, not just bits that deliver the tech. And I remember the gallerist Lee at the time just being a bit amused and obsessed over how long I was spending on that, because the gallery didn't have things like, it didn't have projector mounts and it didn't have things to stand on, so it'd be like an old wooden stool made of street crates with a projector on it, but then everything would be cable clipped like the exact same distance and then across the ground. So I think maybe I've been moving in that space for a while. When I was in CAT, I just thought, Mona spoiled me in terms of detail.
That's neatness, that's not prettiness.
So you think
it's a bit of a drag, but we can Just the joyousness that made this particular in that show, as you said, it's a curatorial thing as opposed to a practice thing.
And I think there's something in that gallery, because I used to be an installer at CAT, so it feels like that rectangle feels a bit like a spiritual home. It's like, how can you fit stuff in there and make it serve the show, not just serve the rectangle? Because you've only got limited options in there. You can put up a couple of wall panels, you can paint some walls, like it's gallery craft 101 in a way. But trying to get it to conform to an idea, that rectangle is tricky. Putting the fridge in the door, that's what I was getting at. I love that fridge in the door. Because the sight line into CAT it's a problematic space, because as you walk up the steps, the first thing you see is the wall on the other side. But it's also a privileged space in that whatever goes on that wall kind of becomes a bit of a hero. And so fucking with that door was a good thing. John?
Yeah, I just asked a question. With the shitstorm work, it said your work is shit, and the issue that was really interesting that we just never foresaw is that the work was put up during the assessment period.
Yeah, that was what.
And
we were just really.
All the students, there were students and staff who got really put out by it. Now, the work was designed to be projecting from the art school out into the world. It was nothing to do specifically with the students' work. They've have said your work is amazing. None of them would have believed it. This is a really interesting thing that happened about how negativity seems to stick, irrespective of whether it's directed.
But it's
positivity we ignore. But the question I was curious about, because I had the privilege of running into you at CAT the other day, and you were telling me about, because something you do really well is I don't know how to describe it, it's like an unpretentious international engagement. What normally happens in Tassie is we curate shows, and it's a big deal to get someone interstate. But you managed to work with people in Russia and God knows where else. And it's done effectively and efficiently, and it works. And not many people do that. Can you speak a bit about that? You spoke a bit with me about it. I think it'd be great for people to hear how you pulled that off, because you covered a lot of the globe. Not much money, and put together a really good show.
I guess I've always corresponded with artists, through the internet in some form or fashion. So if I see someone's work, I'll write to them or reach out to them. And then I guess, and that comes from maybe, so before living in Tasmania for a couple of decades, I'm from sort of semi-regional Victoria. I grew up looking at reproductions, I wasn't going and looking at physical objects. So I guess the demographic similarity between Hobart and where I grew up before moving here is quite similar, except there's much more culture here. So you're more likely to walk into a gallery and see works here. There's a more well-serviced museum here. So I guess the idea of art being distant in some form or fashion, or being accessible and understandable just via reproduction, has always been present. So that idea that someone is more important because they're not from here doesn't really gel for me in that sense. I get it, say whether it's in Hobart or Berrydale or Geelong, David Hockney's a big deal. Yeah, that kind of difference, that differentiation we do with artists, with famous artists, that's what sets up that dichotomy, where you're not going to write to the guy who did the collages for the Dead Kennedys album. Well, why aren't you going to write to that dude? He probably wants to know that someone in Tasmania has been deeply influenced by collages that he made 30 years ago. So I think there's that. And then as an artist, I've always looked at internationally active artists. I've done residencies, I guess, in non-art centres or far-flung places. Not really, not like the Amazon, but Bangkok or Santiago de Compostela or Rotterdam, or non-art centres. So not Paris, not New York, not Italy. So I guess there's that too, that idea that things are happening out there in that sense. And then I think what really solidified it, I ran this one day a week gallery in a little old office in Moona with two dear pals and colleagues, Pip Stafford, the artist, and Andrew Harper, the arts writer and artist. We ran it for a year or so. Between those guys, they kind of had the local and national covered, and I did as well, but I was really interested in, well, how can we, running on a shoestring budget, open one day a week in a wood panelled office with mustard carpet in Moona, how can we show this stuff that's really interesting and influential that's elsewhere? So I'd started writing to artists in Japan via one gallerist that I met there. And so we showed Wataru Komachi, who's a young Japanese kind of drawer, assemblage artist. And that made me go, oh, that's actually not that difficult. Like to just package up a bunch of drawings, convince these people to trust you briefly with the work, send them some photos, show them what you're doing. And then, yeah, so that kind of just became a habit or a practice, I guess. And then some of the artists in Last Messages, they've done a similar thing to me. So Yoshi Sodioka is a Japanese-American artist, works in New York. He has a mixed art and kind of commercial art practice, but he ran a video label where he released a single channel video of my work. So it was like he's doing the same thing in reverse, I guess. Does that speak to it? Or do you, yeah.
But you don't always find these people through galleries, because that's the other thing. Curators are often lazy.
Yeah.
You're just drifting around the web.
I don't have any institutional connections in that I'm not a curator, yeah, so I've never professionally been employed as a curator, so the idea that I'm at dinner and meet the gallerist of blah isn't going to happen, and I'm not going to Art Basel or to even whatever the Australian, to Sydney Contemporary or whatever the Australian version of that is. So those connections aren't how I'm discovering artists. Yeah, I'm looking at people's stuff online and writing to them. Like you, in the past via their email address, and now sometimes via just Instagram or...
That's how I found you.
Yeah. But then obviously, it's a back and forth, because that person, depending on who they are, they want to know how you found their work. They want to know, where is Tasmania, what's the gallery, how much money am I going to get? John Zabelli is actually he's established, but he's not represented American internet artist, but he's kind of deeply cynical. So to convince him to show the work, and then when you send them a link like, here's a MonaFoma website, and they look up Mona and they go, oh, this is a cashed up private museum, that becomes another conversation, because you're like, yeah, but CAT is not a cashed up private museum. This is a satellite event of a festival that's a satellite festival of a major museum. Like, we've got $300, Yeah, so I think that's it. It's just corresponding with people and talking, and then going, so Winston's an interesting one, because I really wanted to try and get an original work of his. They're not easy to access. There was a work that he's basically just got a folder of digital photos, and he hates digital, so he just sends you like a Dropbox link to 100 photos, no context. You don't know what anything is. There was these couple of images that I really loved, and it turns out they were a 3-panel collage on wood, so like a triptych, but what do you call that thing in a church with a tri-panel? Yeah, like that, kind of mimicking that, so with hinged wings and a central piece. And that was the work that I wanted for this show. He actually didn't even know where it was, and me sort of going, look, this thing's amazing, can we possibly borrow it? We ended up landing on, it's water damaged and too fragile to ship here, but he subsequently dug it out and has started restoring it. So it has this on-flow effect where he was like, wow, thank you. I hadn't realised how important that work was, but now I'll refocus on it. That doesn't make it into the show. It doesn't give me anything, but it's kind of like, that's the cool outcome of that correspondence. If he ever does a limited edition print of that work, then maybe it comes into the world in another way, or maybe someone else buys the original. But I guess the thing now I'm interested in is like so not being a curator and working in an arts adjacent role, and being an artist is my primary focus, how I can flex on some of those other connections, because like Wataru Komachi and other artists like young Japanese artists like that, and Piraway Krisasom, who was a Thai artist who we showed through that same gallery, are really fascinating. It would be great to do larger shows with them. But it's also about what works here, yeah, because like museum shows are weighted against someone who's already collected, who's already important, or who's a international white European male. And then gallery shows are specific, like cat shows need to largely be Tasmanian. All the other regional galleries here have their charter. So how do you, like, where are you doing international shows here? If it's not whatever David Walsh thinks is cool.
Cool. I think that's a little bit, over time. So
We thought that 3 to 7 people were going to come to
thanks
that.
guys.
So thank you.